Okay, Ordo ab Chao is Latin, of course, for order from chaos. And what we see happening in the world today is the creation of chaos to destroy a existing system for the benefit of people who are destroying it. And they will then refer to themselves as the phoenix rising from the ashes. And when you drive around to National Harbor in Washington, D.C., if you go into the entrance of it, you'll go past a large sculpture which is built in the shape and colors of a phoenix bird, the phoenix bird that appears on the cover of Doug Valentine's book, The Phoenix Program, about the tragedy of American CIA and uh, just the horror of Vietnam and the real terrorists behind it that work in the CIA and did at the time. And of course, to tie all this together and make it make sense to the people that are voting, the American citizens that really have been bamboozled through all of our lives by history classes in 10th grade and 11th grade in high school, and not knowing that the history that they're teaching us is just part of a historical grand drama that is orchestrated. And that brings me to David Livingstone, who has done a terrific job of putting together 6 whole volumes of work that define as best as he can, and we all are just human, we do the best we can, um, the the systems that have been behind the scenes for hundreds and even thousands of years. So I'm going to use this as a reference. I'm going to not try to read it like I did the um, A Law Unto Itself, the Untold Story of Sullivan Cromwell, which was my most recent reading. Instead, I'm going to use parts of it because they support the work that we're doing to try to understand what's happening in America today. And the first one I wanted to look at, and I'm going to share the screen if I can. And once again, thank you all for your patience as we get started today. But this is the section called the Cliveden Set. Now, you've heard of the Cliveden Set, the Astors and the elites of the 30s and World War II era that were very, very much enamored with Adolf Hitler and the idea of a Nazi-controlled Europe. So let's get into the text. Cliveden House. Before Hitler came, by a German Jew named Dietrich Bronder, claims that not only Hitler but all his leading associates were also Jewish, including Rudolf Hess, Gregor Strasser, Joseph Goebbels, Heinrich Himmler, Joachim von Ribbentrop, parentheses, who maintained a close friendship with the famous Zionist Chaim Weizmann, the first head of the States of Israel, close parentheses, Franz Hanfstaengl, and Aufbau and Tula members. Aufbau and Tula are two of the secret organizations of the 20s and 30s, of course, Alfred Rosenberg and Karl Haushofer. The men also held close associations with members of the Round Table, known as the Cliveden Set, who were committed to a policy of appeasement with Germany. The term appeasement most often applied to the foreign policy of the British governments of Prime Ministers Ramsay MacDonald, Stanley Baldwin, and most notably Neville Chamberlain towards Nazis and fascist Italy between 1935 and 1939. At the beginning of the 1930s, such concessions were widely seen as positive due to the trauma of World War I. Second thoughts about the vindictive treatment of Germany in the Treaty of Versailles, and a perception that fascism was a useful form of anti-communism. Double agent Sidney Riley had been involved in the international scandal known as the Zinoviev letter, a document published by the British Daily Mail 4 days before the general election of October 1924. The letter purported to be a directive from Grigory Zinoviev, the head of Comintern in Moscow, to the Communist Party of Great Britain, which claimed the planned resumption of diplomatic and trade relations by the Labour Party with Soviet Russia would indirectly hasten the overthrow of the British government. Although denounced by Soviet Russia and British communists as a forgery produced by British intelligence agents, conservative politicians and newspapers maintained the document was genuine. The letter helped the Conservative Party by hastening the collapse of the Liberal Party vote that produced a conservative landslide. Stanley Baldwin formed his second government, which saw important tenures of office by Sir Austen Chamberlain, Winston Churchill, and Neville Chamberlain. Okay, that's a bunch of names that are not familiar to us Americans, but the scandal that was called the Zinoviev letter was real, and it was apparently generated by British intelligence in order to collapse the Liberal Party's chances and bring in a conservative landslide, which of course included the Chamberlains and Winston Churchill. Now, Milner, you know the name Milner from the Round Table. So the first point I would take out of that first paragraph is that I never really identified the Cliveden set and the Round Table as being the same people. I think that's a really important understanding of, wow, it's not just that they are the pro-fascist, appeasement party. They're also the Round Table. And this is the key to understanding how the Cliveden set and our history really evolved. Milner's kindergarten included Philip Carr, that's Keerr, later known as Lord Lothian. And I think Lord Lothian was played by Peter Lawford with the bagpipes in The Longest Day. Remember when he walks on the beach? Anyway, Sean Connery stumbles up behind him. Just kidding. Geoffrey Dawson, Edward Wood, who was later Lord Halifax, Lord Bob Brand, Lord Hitchens, and Lionel Curtis. As a group, they continued to pursue the ideals of Milner and Rhodes by launching the famous Round Table Review of Commonwealth Affairs in 1910, which they used as a propaganda tool. This quarterly, founded and edited by Lothian, was, quote, designed to keep open lines of communication around the empire, a function that might later be performed by official representatives if federation became a reality, unquote. Lionel Curtis was seen as the motivating force in the group, while Brand, Lothian's immediate chief in South Africa, introduced Waldorf Astor into the group in 1910. You believe there's somebody named Waldorf Astor? Wow. Who, along with Abe Bailey, a good old Irish name, became its chief financial supporters. Waldorf's cousin was John Jacob Astor IV, the robber baron who died on the Titanic in 1912. Waldorf's father, William Waldorf Astor, owned the Pall Mall Gazette. I was trying to pronounce my English in British ways. And in 1911 bought the Observer at Waldorf's insistence. Dawson and Lothian also played important roles at this time. By 1912, Dawson had become editor of The Times. He later served as secretary of the Rhodes Trust and editor of the Round Table Review, 1941 to 44. Besides being the founder and editor of the Round Table Review, Lothian was secretary of the Milner Group, served as secretary to Lloyd George, and finally, the Milner Group's leader from 1925 to 1940. He was also secretary of the Rhodes Trust and became a lord in 1930. Whoa, Claude Cockbum, it says. Maybe it's Cockburn, and which would be pronounced Coburn, I believe. Anyway, Claude, let me see if there's another instance of his name here. That might be a typo. Okay, well, we'll just go with it. Claude Cockburn, founder and editor of The Week, a pro-communist British weekly, coined the term the Cliveden set in late 1937 when he accused a group of politicians, bankers, shipbuilders, newspaper editors, and other wealthy aristocrats of conspiring to influence the policy of the British government. Nancy Astor and her husband Waldorf Astor held regular weekend parties at their home, Cliveden, a large estate in Buckinghamshire on the River Thames. Astor had taken over control of The Observer, which was purchased by his father from Alfred Harmsworth, Viscount Northcliffe, who was appointed director for propaganda under David Lloyd George and who headed the Tavistock Institute. You have to stop and take a breath when you realize that the Tavistock Institute and the Cliveden set and the Round Table are all the same people. Lord Astor became chairman of the Royal Institute for International Affairs. RIIA founded the Royal Institute for International Affairs, which he had founded in 19, let me see, which he had founded in 1919. He had been chairman in 1930. He had founded in 1919 with Lionel Curtis, who also helped found the Council of Foreign Relations in New York, the CFR. Here's a happy group of Amy Johnson, Charlie Chaplin, Nancy Astor, and George Bernard Shaw. Of course, George Bernard Shaw is a famous Fabian, and we've talked a great deal about Fabians on the Macduff Lives show. There's a number of Macduff minefields that you can look at about that subject. Despite her friendship with Felix Frankfurter, you know who he is, right? An important lawyer and Supreme Court justice. A frequent guest of Nancy Astor at Cliveden was von Ribbentrop, whom she had known since the early 1930s. Astor, who was the first female member of Parliament, MP, in history, and a friend of George Bernard Shaw. Through her involvement with Milner's kindergarten, she became associated with Philip Kerr, that's Kerr, the 11th Marquess of Lothian, a leading advocate of appeasement. She was also a friend of Felix Frankfurter and intervened with the Nazis in Vienna to secure the release of his uncle Solomon. Guests of the Astors at Cliveden included Charlie Chaplin, Winston Churchill, Joseph Kennedy, George Bernard Shaw, von Ribbentrop, Mahatma Gandhi, Amy Johnson, F.D. Roosevelt, H.H. Asquith, T.E. Lawrence, Lloyd George, Arthur Balfour, Henry Ford, the Duke of Windsor, and the writers Henry James, Rudyard Kipling, and Edith Wharton. Those specifically associated with the Cliveden set were mostly members of Milner's kindergarten and included Lothian, Halifax, Dawson, Hoare, Lionel Curtis, Neville Henderson, Robert Brand, and Edward Algernon Fitzroy, who was the Speaker of the House of Commons. Fabian Society member H.G. Wells, who was also a guest at Cliveden, openly expressed his racism and affinity with Hitler in his 1934, quote, experiment in biography, unquote. And here's a quote from H.G. Wells. Make it a little bigger so you can see it easier. It was made a matter of general congratulation about me that I was English, and my mind had leapt all too readily to the idea that I was a blonde and blue-eyed Nordic, quite the best make of human being known. We English, by sheer native superiority, practically without trying, had possessed ourselves of an empire on which the sun never set, and through the errors and infirmities of other races were being forced slowly but steadily and quite modestly toward world dominion. In those days, I had ideas about Aryans extraordinarily like Mr. Hitler's. The more I hear of him, the more I am convinced that his mind is almost the twin of my 13-year-old mind in 1879, but heard through a megaphone and implemented. I do not know from what books I caught my glimpse of the great Aryan people going to and fro in the middle plains of Europe. Unquote. You know, people love H.G. Wells. They love his movies. They love his books. They think his imagination is of, Time Machine and the Warlocks and the Eli and all of that stuff is just so clever. No, it's psychological preparation for the technological New World Order. That is the plan of the Fabians. Okay, these are my comments, not David Livingstone's. But you can't consider H.G. Wells as a good heroic writer, a great dramatist, a wonderful, science fiction genius when you realize that he is a propagandist primarily and not somebody who's writing from the heart. Wallis Simpson and her husband, Edward VIII, Duke of Windsor, a knight of the Order of the Golden Fleece, whose intended marriage caused a constitutional crisis that led to Edward's abdication in 1936, were important agents in the Cliveden set's attempts to broker appeasement with Germany. Edward was the son of King. Wait, look, a little editing needed here in the book, but Edward was the son of King, I think King George. I can't remember which king. Sorry. Edward was born during the reign of his great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, as the eldest child of the Duke and Duchess of York, later King George V. All right, that's the answer. And Queen Mary. Mary had first been engaged to George V's brother, Prince Albert Victor, who was suspected of being Jack the Ripper before he died of influenza in 1892. George V was the son of Edward VII, Prince of Wales, a friend of Nathan Meyer Rothschild, the founder of the Round Table. Hang on. Has anybody else ever said that Nathan Meyer Rothschild was the founder of the Round Table? That's a provocative statement, is it not? Well, once again, I think Mr. Livingstone has done his research, and let's continue and let him fill out what he's saying with some more facts. Who, together with Randolph Churchill, was also implicated in the murders. Okay. Edward VII, the Prince of Wales, friend of Nathan Meyer Rothschild, together with Randolph Churchill, who I think is Winston's father, if I recall, were also implicated in the Jack the Ripper murders. Well, I didn't know that. George V was also a cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm II. George V's mother was Alexandra of Denmark, the daughter of Christian IX of Denmark and Louise of Hesse-Kassel, who was a close friend of Marie de Witznich, Comtesse de Keller, the wife of Saint-Yves d'Alvedre. Oh, Saint-Yves d'Alvedre, he's a fascinating man. The founder of synarchism. Once again, my head goes, whoa. Saint-Yves d'Alvedre founded synarchism? Well, there's a footnote here. We'll follow it later. Queen Mary's mother was Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, a granddaughter of King George III and the third child and younger daughter of Prince Adolphus, Duke of Cambridge, and Princess Augusta of Hesse-Kassel, the niece of Illuminatus and Grand Master of the Asiatic Brethren, Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel. Okay, there's the Illuminati, there's the Rothschilds, there's the Cliveden set. Round table, all tied in together in a few paragraphs. Nancy, that's Nancy Astor, of course, and T.E. Lawrence of Arabia shared a mutual friendship with George Bernard Shaw and his wife Charlotte. In 1921, the future Prime Minister Winston Churchill became colonial secretary and employed Lawrence as an advisor on Arab affairs. The two men grew to admire each other and became lifelong friends. Lawrence's major work is Seven Pillars of Wisdom, an account of his war experiences. In the preface, Lawrence acknowledged the help of his friend George Bernard Shaw in editing the book. Lawrence corresponded with many notable figures. He met Joseph Conrad and commented perceptively on his works. He wrote many letters sharing intimate personal details with Shaw's wife, Charlotte. Nancy got to know Lawrence in the 1920s when he was serving in the RAF. They wrote many letters to one another, and Lawrence also visited Cliveden. Despite their political differences, while Nancy represented the Conservative Party in Parliament and Shaw was a staunch communist, the pair, along with Nancy's husband Waldorf, visited the Soviet Union in 1931 and were even granted a rare interview with Stalin. Interview. I wonder what they talked about. Nancy was also friends with U.S. Ambassador to Britain, Joseph P. Kennedy, who shared her anti-Semitic sentiments. Senior Edward J. S.R. period, I'm not sure what that means. Edward J. Renahan Jr. wrote that, quote, as fiercely anti-communist as they were anti-Semitic, Kennedy and Astor looked upon Adolf Hitler as a welcome solution to both of these world problems. Parentheses, Nancy's phrase, close parentheses. Kennedy replied that he expected the, quote, Jew media, unquote, in the United States to become a problem. That, quote, Jewish pundits in New York and Los Angeles, unquote, were already making noises contrived to, quote, set a match to the fuse of the world, unquote. Along the same lines, Lord Astor told Thomas Jones, the former Secretary of Lloyd George, and Stanley Baldwin in the 1920s, and the newest member of Milner's group, why America misunderstands the British attempt to reach appeasement with Germany. Jones wrote in his diary that Astor said, quote, this is largely due to the intensive and widespread anti-German propaganda being conducted by those Jews and communists. Newspapers are influenced by those firms which advertise so largely in the press and are frequently under Jewish control. One can detect communist inspiration and promptings of which most people are quite oblivious, unquote. Cliveden set member Jeffrey Dawson, an original member of the Milners Kindergarten, was editor of the Times, which had been purchased by John Jacob Astor, 1st Baron Astor of Havre, in 1922, following the death of its owner, Alfred Harmsworth. 1st Viscount Northcliffe was appointed director for propaganda during World War I and head of the Tavistock Institute. Lord Halifax served as British Foreign Secretary between 1938 and 1940, working closely with Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. Dawson was also close to both British Prime Ministers Stanley Baldwin and Chamberlain. In June 1935, Stanley Baldwin appointed Samuel Hoare as Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. In 1916, Hoare had been assigned to British intelligence mission with the Russian General Staff. Giles Milton argues in his, quote, Russian Roulette, How British Spies Thwarted Lenin's Global Plot, unquote, that the original idea to assassinate Rasputin came from Hoare, who believed that Rasputin was sabotaging the Russian war effort, and if he was murdered, quote, the country would be freed from the sinister influence that was striking down its natural leaders and endangering the success of its armies in the field, unquote. Well, that section of our reading this morning should open a lot of questions in people's minds as to what we've read previously, and follow the footnotes up and let's sort through it. It's an amazing and sweeping allegation in this book, but one that resonated with me when I first read it and causes me to really think that um, Livingstone's collection of works here is pretty darn well put together, and I have to congratulate him on it. Um, there might be a little bit of editing here and there that needs to be done in the text, but that happens to all of us, and it's a sweeping, huge project going back hundreds and thousands of years. So once again, I think it's really, really worth our study and thought. Now, the next part is called Harvard Club. And that's got to be interesting to me because my dad was at Harvard from 1938 to 1942. Graduated in the class of 1942, immediately entered the U.S. Navy midshipman school at Columbia and became an officer in the U.S. Navy, which we have also talked a great deal about on the show. So, Harvard Club, huh? Okay. Ernst Putzi Hanfstaengl, whose dates are 1887 to 1975, with Hitler and Goering in 1932. The man who supposedly, quote, discovered, unquote, Hitler and advanced his career in Germany was Ernst Hanfstaengl, a German businessman with key links to the Round Table conspirators and the highest echelons of power in the U.S., right up to the office of the American president at the time. Hanfstaengl, nicknamed Putzi, was born in Munich, the son of a German art publisher and an American mother. His mother was Catherine Wilhelmina Heine, the daughter of William Heine, nephew-in-law of American Civil War Union Army General John Sedgwick. Duke Ernst II of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, the older brother of Queen Victoria's older brother Albert, was Hanfstaengl's godfather. Hanfstaengl spent most of his early years in Germany, but later moved to the United States and attended Harvard University. And through his membership in the Harvard Club, he counted among his friends Theodore Roosevelt Jr., Franklin Delano Roosevelt, then a senator from New York, T.S. Eliot, John Reed, and Walter Lippmann. Of course, Walter Lippmann is one of the people we've studied in connection with Bernays and the whole idea of creating a elite behind the scenes management team of really smart and elite people that are going to manage the public opinion and thereby control public policy. And Walter Lippmann, who was also associated with the Tavistock Institute, where he had been appointed to handle the manipulation of American public opinion in preparation for the entry of the United States into World War I. Once again, I keep getting these mind-blowing connections. I knew about Lippmann. I've read a lot about Lippmann, but nobody ever said that he was appointed by the Tavistock Institute to handle the manipulation of American public opinion, before World War I. And he probably came up with, the Uncle Sam Needs You posters and what was it? The war to end all wars. That was it. So was he? That's what we have here. I need, to absorb this stuff. And if I believe it is accurately true, then I have to, once again, reorganize my thoughts of how we got to where we are here today. Amazing. John Reed was an American socialist activist, best remembered for his first-hand account of the Bolshevik Revolution, quote, 10 Days That Shook the World, unquote, which featured an introduction by Lenin. Reed died in Russia in 1920 and was buried at the Kremlin Wall necropolis, only one of two Americans to have been given this honor in Russia. Reed also attended meetings of the Socialist Club, over which Lippmann presided. Hamstengel graduated Harvard in 1909. He moved to New York and took over the management of the American branch of his father's business, the Franz Hamstengel Fine Arts Publishing House. As he says, quote, the famous names who visited me were Legion, Pierpont Morgan, Toscanini, Henry Ford, Caruso, Santos Dumont, Charlie Chaplin, Paderewski, and a daughter of President Wilson, unquote. It was also at Harvard that Hamstengel made friends with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who became president in 1933, the same year as Hitler's rise to power. A private message was sent from Roosevelt to Hamstengel in Berlin to the effect that Roosevelt hoped that Hamstengel would do his best to prevent any rashness and hot-headedness on the part of Hitler, and that, quote, if things start getting awkward, please get in touch with our ambassador at once. As recounted by Andrew Nagorski in Hitlerland, American eyewitness to the Nazi rise to power, after his return to Germany in 1922, Warren Robbins, a Harvard classmate serving at the U.S. Embassy in Berlin, called Hamstengel in Munich to ask him to assist Truman Smith, a young military attaché working for American Ambassador Alanson B. Houghton, Houghton. Smith was sent to Munich to, quote, try to make personal contact with Hitler himself and form an estimate of his character, personality, abilities, and weaknesses, unquote. Smith would later point out that most foreign diplomats in Berlin at the time had written off the National Socialists as, quote, being without significance, and described the party leader Adolf Hitler as an uneducated madman. Houghton, in contrast, quote, seems to have had, even at this early date, a premonition that the movement and its leader might play an important role in the disturbed Germany of the early 20s. Smith quickly met a diverse group of people, recording his discussions and impressions, including Aufbau member Max Erwin von Scheubner-Richter, General Friedrich Freiherr Kress von Kressenstein, the artillery commander of the German Army's 7th Division, told Smith he hadn't met Hitler, but had the impression that the man was, quote, an oratorical genius, unquote. In his report filed to Washington, Smith characterized Hitler as, quote, a marvelous demagogue. I have rarely listened to such a logical and fanatical man, unquote. When they finally met, Smith gave Hamstengel his press pass to a Nazi rally that evening. Hamstengel's first impression of Hitler was underwhelming. Quote, in his heavy boots, dark suit, and leather waistcoat, I should say waistcoat, right? Semi-stiff white collar and odd little mustache, he really did not look very impressive. Like a waiter in a railway station restaurant, Hamstengel recalled. But once Hitler took the podium, the atmosphere became, quote, electric. Hamstengel introduced himself to Hitler after the speech and began a close friendship and political association that would last through the 20s and 30s. For much of the 20s, Hamstengel introduced Hitler to Munich high society and helped polish his image. Hitler was the godfather of Hamstengel's son, Egon. Egon, wasn't he in Ghostbusters? Oh, never mind. Hamstengel composed both Brown Shirt and Hitler Youth marches, patterned after his Harvard football songs, and, he later claimed, devised the salute Sieg Heil. By December 1920, when Alfred Rosenberg's Völkisch Observer was heavily in debt, Dietrich Eckart initiated its purchase by the Nazi Party, and funds for a printing press were provided by Hamstengel. When the beer hall putsch failed, Hanfstaengl fled to Austria, but when Hitler's car broke down, he decided to seek refuge with Hanfstaengl's wife, Helen, who reportedly prevented him from committing suicide. Hanfstaengl was intimately associated with Aleister Crowley's friend and co-conspirator, Hans Evers, Ewers, who worked the secretive propaganda cabinet of Max Warburg's associate, Dr. Bernard Dernburg, with George Sylvester Viereck and Harvard professor Hugo Münsterberg. Evers was also an associate of Guido von List, Lanz von Liebenfels. Evers wrote a screenplay about the Nazi martyr Horst Wessel that was produced by Hanfstaengl. Evers was a longtime friend of Wessel, a Berlin leader of the SA. That's the Sturmabteilung, or the brown shirts. After his murder in 1930, he was made into a martyr for the Nazi cause by Joseph Goebbels. Hitler himself asked Evers to write the book about Wessel, but titled Einer von vielen, one of many. During the last years of the Weimar Republic, Evers became involved with the Nazi Party, attracted by its nationalism, its Nietzschean moral philosophy, and its cult of Teutonic culture, and joined the NSDAP in 1931. Despite his involvement with the Nazi, Evers' main character in his horror novels, Frank Brown, is depicted as having a Jewish mistress, Lotte Levy, who is also a patriotic German. This was one of the factors which ended Evers' popularity with the Nazi leadership. With the addition to his homosexual tendencies, he soon lost favor with party leaders. In 1934, most of his works were banned in Germany, and his assets were were seized. Alfred Rosenberg was his main adversary in the party, but after submitting many petitions, Evers eventually secured the rescission of the ban. The Mitford sisters. Jessica, Nancy, Diana, Unity, and Pamela in 1935. Hanfstaengl was a friend of Unity Valkyrie Freeman Mitford, She was one of the six infamous Mitford sisters who achieved contemporary notoriety for their controversial and stylish lifestyles and politics. The Mitford family is an aristocratic English family who trace their origins in Northumberland back to the time of the Norman conquest. Their principal line had its seats at Mitford, Northumberland. While their feuds were made very public, in private the sisters got along very well. They were caricatured by the Times journalist Ben McIntyre as, quote, Diana the fascist, Jessica the communist, Unity the Hitler lover, Nancy the novelist, Deborah the duchess, and Pamela the unobtrusive poultry connoisseur, unquote. The Mitford family were extensively interwoven with that of the Churchills. The sisters' father was David Freeman Mitford, 2nd Baron Redesdale. David's father, Bertram, called Bertie, was a diplomat and traveler who held minor office in Benjamin Disraeli's second ministry. In 1874, Bertie married Clementina, the second daughter of David Ogilvy, 10th Earl of Airlie. Blanche Ogilvy, Clementina's elder sister, became the wife of Sir Henry Montague Hosier, a soldier turned businessman. Their 4 children included daughters Clementine, who in 1908 married Winston Churchill, and Nellie, who married Bertram Romilly. However, Bertie had an affair with Clementine's mother and may have been her real father, making the Mitford sisters cousins to Winston and Clementine Churchill's son, Randolph. Bertie's eldest son, Clement, married Clementine's cousin, Helen Hosier. Clementine's nephew, Esmond Romilly, would marry Jessica Mitford. Jessica renounced her privileged background at an early age and became an adherent of communism. Jessica became a well-known writer, the author of The American Way of Death, in 1963. She later married Robert Truhaft, a Jewish American civil rights lawyer. And here is a picture of Oswald Mosley, devotee of Aleister Crowley, founder of the British Union of Fascists. While Jessica turned to the left, Unity and her sister Diana turned to fascism. The Churchills' eldest daughter, Diana, was a flower girl at Diana Mitford's wedding to Brian Guinness, heir to the barony of Moyne, and she was often invited for extended visits or parties at Clementine and Winston Churchill's country house. Diana, however, divorced Guinness for Sir Oswald Mosley, with whom she was having an affair. Mosley was a devotee of Aleister Crowley and the founder of the British Union of Fascists. Mosley's closest ally was a disciple of Crowley, Major General J.F.C. Fuller. While serving in the 1st Oxfordshire Light Infantry, Fuller had entered and won a contest to write the best review of Crowley's poetic works, after which it turned out that he was the only entrant. This essay was later published in book form in 1907 as The Star in the West. After this, he became an enthusiastic supporter of Crowley, joining his magical order, within which he became a leading member, editing Order documents and its journal, The Equinox. In 1920, Mosley married Lady Cynthia Curzon, daughter of Round Tabler Lord Curzon. When his father died in 1928, Mosley became Sir Oswald Mosley, 6th Baronet of Ancoats. In 1931, Mosley went on to a study tour of the, quote, new movements of Italy's Benito Mussolini and other fascists, and returned convinced that it was the way forward for him and for Britain. He was determined to unite the existing fascist movements and created the British Union of Fascists in 1932. Diana and Oswald married in secret in Germany in 1936 in the Berlin home of Joseph Goebbels, where Hitler was one of the guests. Mosley spent large amounts of his private fortune on the British Union of Fascists, negotiating with Hitler through Diana for permission to broadcast commercial radio to Britain from Germany. And look at this picture, Hitler with Magda and Joseph Goebbels. Wonder what they're looking at. Diana became well acquainted with Winifred Wagner and Magda Goebbels. Johanna Maria Magdalena Magda Goebbels was the wife of Hitler's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels. A prominent member of the Nazi Party, she was a close ally, companion, and political supporter of Adolf Hitler. When she was 8 years old, Magda's mother married Jewish businessman and leather goods magnate Richard Friedlander and moved with him to Brussels in 1908. Friedlander's residency card, found in Berlin archives, stated that Magda was his biological daughter. Friedlander was later killed in the Buchenwald Christian concentration camp. Amazing, isn't it? While in Berlin, Magda became very close friends with a young Jewish girl who lived near the Friedlanders in Berlin. The Jewish girl, Lisa, became her closest friend, through whom she met Lisa's older brother, Victor Arlosorov, who would become one of the most important leaders of labor Zionism. Victor and Magda became lovers, and she wore a Star of David given to her by him, and together they attended Zionist meetings. Magda continued to carry on the affair even after she married Dr. Günther Quandt, the successful industrialist. And we've studied the Quandt family a couple of years ago on our show. I would have to go back and find it, but it's an interesting lead, the Quandt family. By the time she had divorced Quandt, Victor had left for Palestine to join the Jewish Agency and work for the establishment of a state of Israel. Magda later married Goebbels in 1931, with Hitler as his best man. Randolph Churchill relentlessly criticized his cousin Unity Mitford for her crush on Hitler. Unity, who was conceived in the town of Swastika, Ontario, Canada. I kid you not, where her family owned gold mines, was famous for her adulation of and friendship with Hitler. After meeting Unity and Diana, Hitler described them as the perfect examples of Aryan women. Her middle name was Valkyrie, after the war maidens in the opera of Wagner, Hitler's favorite composer and a friend Unity's of Unity's grandfather, Lord Redesdale. Redesdale had also translated books by Houston Stewart Chamberlain, whose racial theories influenced Hitler's Mein Kampf. Price Jones reports that, quote, she, that is Mitford, saw him, it seemed, more than 100 times. No other English person could have anything like that access to Hitler. Hitler's inner circle, however, suspected she was a British spy. Nevertheless, when Hitler announced the Anschluss in 1938, Unity appeared with him on the balcony in Vienna. Well, it's coming up to 12 noon here, and it is a break, I guess. We can stop here. I'm really tempted to go on because of Pamela Harriman coming into the picture here, but perhaps we'll leave that for another time. Well, let's go ahead. Unity was a friend of Pamela Harriman, the great niece of Jane Digby, quote, who coaxed Unity into taking her to tea with Hitler in 1937 in Munich. Pamela, then 17, was then attending boarding school. In 1939, while working at the Foreign Office in London doing French to English translations, Pamela met Winston Churchill's son, Randolph. As he was heading off to war and convinced he would die, and having already been turned down by 8 other women, Randolph proposed to her immediately after dinner. Pamela accepted, and they had a son named Winston, reflecting Pamela's warm relationship with her father-in-law. Shortly after giving birth, Pamela and the newborn were photographed by Cecil Beaton for Life magazine, its first cover of a mother with baby. She moved in to 10 Downing Street when Churchill became Prime Minister. Lord Beaverbrook became her mentor. Franklin Roosevelt's envoy Harry Hopkins became her friend, and she had an affair with W. Averill Harriman, through whom she became a back channel to U.S. British negotiations. All right, there's a good place to stop, tying it all now into the present by mentioning of the connection of the Cliveden set to W. Averill Harriman, whose shadow is cast very darkly upon our present day. And let me go over to the chat room and say hello. I know a lot of you are on channels where you don't see the chat room, but I hadn't had a chance to look at it yet tonight because of, well, the technical stuff at the beginning. So let me just scroll through before I sign off this morning. And thank you very much for your patience and your willingness to stick with me as I struggled through that little technical problem. All right. Well, thank you all very much, and I will see you tomorrow. Tomorrow, let's see, it's Tuesday, and I have a very special interview lined up for you. It's Hervoye Morgic, and he is one of the hosts at TNT Radio. He publishes Geopolitics and Empire on Twitter, and he is quite an interesting man that I want to get to know better. He was kind enough to interview me about 3 weeks ago, which you can find on TNT Radio. It's audio only. And we will learn about him and his journey through life as we get back together tomorrow at 11 a.m. right here. And I've got a little technical work to do. So I'll see you then. Bye now.